a number of masked actors seem to be more and more glamorous in attacking Ethiopia's existence by working in close collaboration with the terrorist group. So how should Ethiopians defend themselves against these forces which are trying to undermine Ethiopia's integrity and sovereignty? Ladies and gentlemen, this is Addis Dialogue. With the program, I'm Fitz-Gerald. My guest today is Fitz-Gerald. She's the director of Bolzili School of International Affairs and professor of international security at Wilfrid Laurier University. We're going to talk about current issues unfolding in Ethiopia. Stay with us. Prof, thank you so much, as usual, for joining me.
Very happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you, Prof. As you know, one of the latest issues popping up when it comes to Ethiopia is this international commission of human rights experts report on Ethiopia. And the report tries to come up with a range of accusations, allegations against Ethiopia. And many are calling it incomplete, incoherent, and politically motivated. And you know, the report didn't even consider the work done by the joint investigation of the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. I was wondering if you have seen this report, and if so, can you talk me through some of your observations, Professor?
I have seen the report. I think that any investigation into human rights abuses is in principle a very good thing. But I think, again, as a researcher, the research and the data analysis that goes into these things is critically important. As someone that has worked in Ethiopia and lived in Ethiopia periodically for the last 25 years, I did feel that there was an imbalance to the analysis. And I believe that the analysis was quite incomplete as well, largely because this group had a limited mandate. And when commissions and groups that are given a task have a limited mandate, limited resources follow. And I gather from certainly what was circulating in the media and on social media, its movements were limited in the country. And according to the methodology, there was an incident-based approach taken. And in methodology, we do use what's called phenomenological approaches to research, which include case study approaches, but you need to really defend why those case studies can provide sufficient evidence based on robust investigation that can then be generalized from. Generalizations can be drawn from. And I certainly wasn't convinced that the incidents that were selected and what I felt was an incomplete investigation behind those incidents could be generalized from. So I would expect a report with a limited mandate like that, or an exercise with a limited mandate, limited resources, to really add value in proposing areas for further research. And I mean, my question right from the outset is, why the joint investigation team that was made up of UN officials and officials from the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission that did work in the region of Tigray, and yet what followed June 2021, the movement and the insurrections into Amhara and Afar, those two regions became the mainstay of the battlefields in this war. And I still question why, after being heralded as a relatively successful investigation, why the same methodology underpinning the joint investigation team's approach in Tigray was not applied in Amhara or Afar. I have not to this day seen an acceptable explanation of why that wasn't the case. Such a methodology and approach could have even included a mandate for the team to return to Tigray and do a more complete data gathering exercise, which built on the data gathered from where the reporting team had left off and had published their first report. But, this is full of inconsistencies, full of, what can work in a limited period of time approach. And I mean, this is a big issue. This is an investigation into human rights atrocities and violations. And the methodology must be robust and the data must be comprehensive. The data sets used must be comprehensive. There's a lot of information out there that's been published online, that's been published in journals, in different commentaries. There's an empirical base out there that I just did not see reflected in the report. And hopefully what we'll see is some continuity, not just with the methodology that builds on the joint investigation team, which elements of the United Nations and other global leaders held up as relatively successful. So I'm not sure why a relatively successful methodology could not then be carbon copied and continued into the other two regions heavily affected by conflict. So I think as ever with this conflict over the past year, we're seeing ongoing incomplete analysis. We're seeing fresh views and fresh perspectives, which are healthy and always very good, but the context behind this conflict is really important. And there's a lot of knowledge that sits behind recent history that is directly related to this conflict and the tactics used in this conflict that one needs to become familiarized with if one is to extend an analysis to the current day.
Okay. Professor, there is also another issue being raised when it comes to this report, and that is issues of coverage. And many also say it's rushed. And on the other hand, while Ethiopians are voicing their anger, frustration at this report, members of the terrorist group seem to be content with the contents of this so-called report. So can this somehow show some kind of collusion with the people behind the report?
Well, I can't comment on the extent to which there was collusion. I am very surprised that the United Nations, what is meant to be and is in the world the leading authority for peace and security, has rushed an incomplete report and an advanced copy of a report over and above its incomplete nature seems to have been produced in lightning speed based on the time that the team was on the ground collecting the evidence. These exercises usually require validation, further triangulation. But I mean, I've asked questions about a lot of the research approaches and methodologies used in reports about this conflict.
So obviously this is like, adding insult to injury following the looting and vandalism TPLF caused previously in Afar and Amhara region. You also have seen the situation in person coming all the way from Canada. It has also caused these unspeakable crimes against humanity in the two regions, Amhara and Afar regions. So, but however, the narratives are, as you know, the other way around. So what's the gamble being, unfolded here, Prof?
Well, interesting word you use, the gamble. I think, as is the case with any peace talks, and peace talks, many peace talks that scholars like myself have tracked over the years. The gamble, of course, is that talks of this sort proceed while the fighting continues. And in conflicts elsewhere in the world, sometimes you see the phenomena of splits within warring factions and parties to the conflict. And I think this is why some sort of formalized truce needs to be signed up to, with commitments underpinning that truce. The other side of this gamble is that if fighting continues, then government, I mean, the responsibility of government is to protect and secure the safety of its population, its borders, and importantly, its sovereignty. So a government cannot sit passively by when there is ongoing insurrectionist movements across regional borders and the country's international borders as well. So the other side of the gamble is that as the fighting continues and the government fulfills its responsibility to its citizens, you know, there's a big microscope sitting over Ethiopia right now, and it becomes further criticized in this false sense of parity argument between a regional insurrectionist entity and a federal legitimate government becomes cemented and further strengthened. And I believe that's one of the big objectives here on the TPLF side.
The other side of that we're getting familiar with is whenever TPLF wages war against the government, we are highly likely, to see the Security Council get busy holding sessions on Ethiopia. And also international financial institutions seem to be kind of reluctant, to support Ethiopia wherever there is conflict. So what's the scheme being cooked up here that you see there, Prof?
Well, I don't know if it's a scheme. I think, in some cases, you can divide media and commentary into various groups. And, whilst there's been a lot of criticism lodged towards different entities in the international major media domain, there are other media organizations that have done their best to bring more balance to the picture. It's very, very difficult when Tigray has been effectively sealed off, and when the government and any entities related to the federal government, which accounts for most of the country at each level, the federal level, the zonal level, the Wareda level, the Kabeli level. I mean, it really effectively cannot cross the border into one of its own regional states, and that's the bizarre nature of this conflict at the moment, that a federal government does not have control and a say and a trump card over a regional entity in the country that it controls and that it leads. So I can't comment on issues concerning looted money because we just don't have the data on that. And my work depends on data analysis, although there is enough data out there to suggest that this war is being driven by economics. And certainly where I'm speaking to you from in Waterloo, Canada, there's a professor at University of Waterloo, Teferi Murgo, who wrote very early on in the conflict in foreign policy and talked about some of these economic phenomena. As for the media, my view has always been that media outlets really need to come to the ground and speak to the people and not rely on the global network and groups with other agenda in the global network. I'm an academic. I'm not a media representative. I'm not skilled, nor do I have the competencies as a media representative. I have the competencies of a chaired research professor. That being said, when I was in Afar gathering my data for a variety of research projects at the moment, and when I was speaking to the conflict-affected victims and communities, I was quite surprised that no other member of the media had been there. And I followed protocol, the same kind of protocol that media representatives need to follow to get into the North Wallo, the South Wallo, and the Northern Afar regions. And there's no reason why other journalists cannot do this as well and not continue to write from very remote positions. And we often hear about satellite imagery being used, but I question some of the arguments that satellite imagery is being used to substantiate. With some arguments there's a connection, but with other arguments there's a disconnect. And I do think that these groups need to get onto the ground. The triggers for media engagement are also concerning reports that are published by rights organizations and international commissions and UN offices, letters being written by TPLF leaders, developments on the ground as well, but often with dominant perspectives from those who are aggressively reaching out to the media. Information, and I think that the government of Ethiopia has learned a very hard lesson, as have, I'm sure, African countries elsewhere on the continent and other countries across the world, that these days, especially for countries that face instability, potential insurrectionist movements, potential disaggregation of society, information becomes one of the most powerful instruments of national power. And so a multi-pronged, well-resourced strategy is required to be in place to not just stay ahead of the information curve, but to nurture those important relationships across the information space that become trusted relationships that can be relied on. It doesn't help that there are international media representatives who, because of allegations of ethics and behavior, have been asked to leave the country. One would then question, well, what incentive is there to support or to try to liaise with and continue appreciating the view of a government that has asked it to leave the country and has displaced it. So there's all sorts of conflicting dynamics here that are not helping for the production of a balanced, well-informed narrative.
Okay. The other area that I want to hear your comments on is the recent TPLF so-called call to negotiate under the auspices of the African Union. What's your reading of this call, Prof?
I think that it's an acknowledgement on the part of the TPLF that the AU will lead. Like there is really no alternative when you have an authority like the African Union on the continent, and when you have countries and a donor community that for the last 30 years, in my recollection, has been pushing for African solutions to African problems. And when you have an organization that has led these types of peace talks in the past, I think that it's an acknowledgement by the TPLF that this issue is not going to change. The African Union will lead. However, on the other hand, the TPLF leaders have called for others to be part of the process. And, in some ways, one could argue that this may be advantageous to the country and to the government, particularly if it exposes a lack of commitment on the TPLF's part, or indeed demands that, suggests that there's a questionable commitment to peace. On the other hand, AU peace processes have been successful elsewhere in Africa, and there's no real reason, I think, to a lot of Ethiopians, and no doubt to the Ethiopian government, that a peace process shouldn't be as successful here, even with other African representatives. it's also questionable as to what, other than, maybe technical support and funding support, Western powers will bring into the peace talk room. What added value? I mean, African leaders they lead the world at dialogue, and from traditions and customs and norms, they have the most experience doing this at the peripheral level, doing this at the central level. African-led dialogue has always been dialogue that's been quite respected. And, we've seen success cases that have been written about in the literature. We've seen other cases that have been relatively successful that haven't been written about in the literature. But people like myself have been involved in them on the continent.
Yeah. But Prof, on the other hand, many say that it's just a bluff, the TPLF just wants to buy time and to kind of attack the government. Is there some kind of, does this hold water?
I think what we're seeing is a bit of an entanglement between three variables. One variable is that the TPLF have to be seen to be coming closer to the peace talks table, or else, some big questions are being asked, whether peace is even in their sights. On the other hand, there is ongoing fighting and disturbance, because that ongoing fighting can help create narratives. And I'm not suggesting whether there's any truth or non-truth to these narratives, but the main narratives that are being circulated concern Eritrea's involvement in the conflict, which is a narrative that's being promoted at the moment. And that narrative would not come to the fore unless there was ongoing aggressive troop deployments to borders of Tigray. The other narrative that's being pushed is this ongoing unfettered humanitarian access narrative. Now, I was in northern Afar, and I was close to the border of Afar going into the region of Tigray, and seemed to be an open road with unhindered access. There's been issues concerning trucks and fuel, etc. We know that, and we don't have to repeat that argument. But this unfettered humanitarian access, no matter how important it is as a general principle and argument, is becoming used by the TPLF as an ongoing soundbite. And I think, there's no question of the commitment to the people that all stakeholders, the humanitarian partners, the global donor community, the Ethiopian people, the Ethiopian government, have towards the humanitarian effort. I think the problems have been at the logistical end of the humanitarian effort. And then the third variable is that the TPLF and TPLF affiliates are trying very hard to keep these issues that I've just mentioned on the desks of global leaders. And aggressive efforts are being made to bring these things to the attention of members of parliament in different countries, or senators, House representatives in the US, to the European Union, to the UN, to rights commissions, etc. So in my view, these ongoing efforts are being pursued to try to bring about international intervention, more substantial international intervention. So this is the agenda that I feel is being balanced, a half-baked commitment to peace talks, an agenda that tries to keep information and a narrative on certain issues like Eritrea, like unfettered humanitarian access being pushed, and really the international community being engaged with the hope that more substantial intervention will be forthcoming. I think, if any intervention needs to be forthcoming, it needs to be intervention that monitors the truth about what's really going on in an area that's effectively been sealed off, except to humanitarian partners, and an area in northern Tigray where there's no international representatives really around aside from forces patrolling their space and patrolling their borders, and really monitoring to ensure that humanitarian aid gets to the end user and the communities that it's really intended for.
How should the international community support Ethiopia, which finds itself in the midst of pressures and things like that?
I believe this war has gone on for far too long. And I believe that North American and European partners of Ethiopia are also tired of this ongoing and unnecessary conflict and bloodshed that the conflict is bringing. I think leading partners of Ethiopia's need to stop treating an insurrectionist rebel group as if it has special status next to a legitimate government, a government that, let's not forget, and sadly, without the vote of the Tigrayan people, still secured almost had a 80% voter turnout, high 70s anyway, which is good compared to any Western country voter turnout in a federal election, let alone next to any African country. So it's a legitimate government. I think the international community, and I hope this is ongoing already, they need to speak with and engage with some of the ordinary Tigrayans being housed in the various IDP camps in Amhara and Afar, simply to get some additional perspective over and above the perspective that is clogging the airwaves, which is the perspective of the TPLF leadership and of the some members of the Tigrayan diaspora. And also to agree on terms of a lasting ceasefire and have some accountability behind those terms. And to bring about accountability, there needs to be monitoring, there needs to be transparency and reporting, not necessarily to report back to the public and the global public. Certainly in the case of the Northern Ireland peace process, there was accountability, but there was reporting back from a decommissioner, a commissioner and a number of deputy commissioners to the stakeholders that had an interest in the resolution of the conflict. And that kept stakeholders satisfied, and some sort of monitoring and accountability process needs to back this ceasefire, or else the ceasefire will not be lasting. It should also include a program which disarms groups and gets groups to lay down arms. This is terribly important because, and not just in the Tigray region, other regions as well, but in the Tigray region, there has been a distribution of arms that has been so wide since back in the 1980s, and the security sector in Tigray is heavily regimentalized right to the village level. And much needed security reforms are required in Ethiopia that really reform the way that the regional security sector, which includes paramilitary elites, work. But those reforms cannot advance until Parliament is in good order, which, if Tigray is going to remain a part of Ethiopia, and we all desperately hope it does, Tigrayan brothers and sisters need to be represented in Parliament. At the moment, this conflict is not just boycotting Parliament, but it's boycotting the reform process. And there are very repressive policies and repressive and slightly authoritarian laws and legislation that need to be reformed in order for the government to work hard for the people that voted for democracy. when the people spoke in the last election, it was a win for democracy. It was a win, the voter turnout, the commentary that was happening, the civil society engagement. It was a win for democracy to a large extent in Ethiopia. And in order for the government to start taking those democratic reforms and policies forward, things that were in place in the past need to be changed. And Tigray needs to be part of that discussion.
Absolutely. Professor, thank you so much for your wonderful ideas as usual.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, the viewers, with that, we come to the end of today's program. Thank you so much for having been with us. Until I see you next time with another program, it's goodbye from me, Fitz-Gerald.